Thanks for clicking on part 2. Let's get back to it. Then once all my pieces are cut out, I'll start pinning everything together. You'll see that I cut a few snips in the seam allowance on the left curved side of the chest to help lay this tricky seam evenly along the other side. And then I'll also cut a few snips in at the curve of the waist, anywhere in the seams where the fabric is curving in towards the waist. I'll just cut the seam allowance as close as I feel comfortable into the stitching, and this is going to help those seams lay nice and smooth. Now, usually I would sew all of the shell pieces and then all of the lining pieces together at one time. This costume that I'm filming was a commission, so I sew the seams a little bit differently. I'll sew the side seams up last and leave the edges so that it's easy for my client to alter. So if you're making one for yourself, I do suggest sewing all the shell pieces to each other and then all the lining pieces to each other, and just leave the lining and the shell open at the center back, not also the side seams like I'm doing here. And then lastly, when I am done sewing all of the seams up, I'm going to stop what I'm doing and iron. Ironing is absolutely the most important thing to make your costume look nice and finished. Without ironing, your costume will look frumpy. It's not going to look nice and, crispy. So I like to just iron as much as I can, because ironing is really going to give your costume a professional, nice look. For the boning, I like to use a sew-on plastic boning. This is a little hard to find, but I think it helps the seams look crisper. It cuts down on bulk and also skips the step of making a boning channel. I fold a little scrap of fabric over the top and the bottom of each piece so that over time the boning doesn't rub through the fabric. I do this for all the seams. This is one of the places a mock-up will help you a lot, because not only can you practice sewing the boning in, you can also see how far down you should place the bones. Depending on your body shape, you may want to stop the boning higher or lower or right at the waistline. It really depends on your shape and how it sits on you. So I definitely recommend making a mock-up and testing the boning on it. When I sew my trim in, I like to sew it to the lining first to make sure I like the placement. Then I'll pin on my satin layer and use my first line of stitching as a guide. Lastly, I'll open my seam up and sew the seam allowance to the lining. This is a small extra step that will help keep the lining from rolling over the upper edge of the bodice, and it'll add a little structure. The next step is to sew the bottom edge of the bodice and then trim all of the seams. Once it's sewn, I will trim the seam to 1/4 inch just about everywhere, but I will snip into any curves and I'll trim really close to all of the points to keep it from being too bulky when I turn them out. Turning the points requires a lot of patience, and I'll alternate between using a point turner from the inside and pulling it out from the outside with the seam ripper or a dull needle. If you don't have a point turner, try using a knitting needle. Once I have that point turned out, the very last thing I'll do is just iron the whole bottom seam, the top, pretty much do a final ironing of just everything so it looks nice and crisp. Then I would sew in the zipper, and I would love to show you how I sew in the zipper, but I don't know what happened to the footage. I don't know if I completely forgot, maybe my memory card filled up, I didn't notice, I don't know, but I don't have it. Fortunately, it's not super hard. I will just fold my seam allowance over and pin in my zipper and top stitch it. You can only really use a separating zipper here. It's not possible to use an invisible zipper, so there really isn't too many fancy things you can do besides just top stitch in a separating zipper. Next is the arm puffs. For these, I kind of use an amalgamation of all the techniques I've done up to this point. I'll sew my trim to the lining of the arm puff, gather the top layer, pin it on, and then sew all 3 layers together. But before I turn the arm puff right side out, I'm going to sew along the edge of the seam allowance to create a channel for elastic to go through. I used a serger, but you don't really have to. I just did it to get some of the raw edge bits out of my way. You can use a safety pin to feed the elastic through, but I'm using this fancy tube called a fast turn. This isn't exactly what this tool is meant for, but I find it a bit easier to thread the elastic through this way, and since I already own it, I'm going to use it. I pull a piece of elastic that's a bit smaller than my arm all the way through and sew it down on both ends. I do this for both seams inside the puff. This elastic will help the arm puff fit nice and snug around my arm once it's finished. After turning it right side out, I'll do my best to at least sew the inside band together with the machine. This is a really tight squeeze, so watch your fingers. Then I'll use a ladder stitch to sew together the outside. I do my best to make my stitches neat and keep this a nice hidden seam, and then my arm puff is all finished.
Okay, so this is it, all finished. This is actually my personal costume. The one I was working on in the video was for a client. It was a commission. So you may notice a couple different things on this one, like the colors of the zippers, but I wanted you to see how the petticoat, like how it fluffs out the skirt and then just how everything lays. I'm gonna come in for a couple close-ups with the camera and let you see. So this is something that I do in my costumes if they're strapless, and then as well as the costumes I make for commissions, is I put in this elastic, kind of like a bra strap, and it's adjustable, and I sew it into the side seams of my costume. This helps the costume stay up, because no matter how well a strapless bodice is fitted, it's inevitably going to start sliding down, so this really helps with that. You can also see on my first costume, this was the first one that I ever made. Now I've made several for commissions, but I chose to put the inside together a little different, and that's what I mean by saying there's really no one right way to put this together. You can really do it however you think is going to work best for you. In this case, I put a facing in mine, and didn't change my serging thread to pink, just the black. That's really classy. And then if it was for a customer, I would have definitely not left that black if I had pink available. So I also top stitch in my zipper for this one. With the separating zipper, that seems to be the easiest thing for me to do. And then I also left plenty of extra here on the back in case I ever want to let it in or out. It doesn't zip up on my mannequin, but you get the idea. So another thing I did in my personal costume was I sewed in booby cups because your girl needs all the help she can get. This helps a lot hold the shape, like it doesn't, I don't know, get dented or anything. I don't know, maybe people with boobs don't have the same problems as me. I don't know, but I just sewed them in on the edges. If you put them under the lining, it can cause a little bit of bulk in your lining layer. It's definitely possible, but it's a cosplay, so I just sewed them on the inside. It looks pretty good, and you can't see it from the outside, so what does it matter?
And that's a wrap. Guys, thank you so much for watching my video. It's a really long video and it took me a long time to make, so please give it a like or leave a comment if it helped you out. Seeing that stuff really makes me happy. Feel free to check out my Instagram where I post more costume stuff and mini tutorials and things like that. And that's the end of this video. I'll see you all in the next one.